Povetkin versus Whyte 2. Rumble on the Rock, repeat or revenge, ends up being revenge on the part of Dillian Whyte, who stops Alexander Povetkin in the 4th round via a left hook. But after that win, where does this leave Dillian Whyte and what is next for him on the agenda? Who is he going to fight next? We're going to talk about all of that on this video. Welcome back to the channel. Of course, I'm Budge, and you're now tuned in to Talk to Budge. Please, wipe your feet before you come in. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and sign up for all notifications so you're always aware when the latest video drops. I need your help, your support, your engagement, and all the rest of it. This is, of course, a platform for me to speak, but of course for you to speak to me as well. So leave your feedback on the topics and the things that we discuss in the comment section. I want to hear from you and hear your perspective and your point of view as well. Okay, cool. So in the video, I mentioned that we're going to be talking about what is next for Dillian Whyte. Where does he go from here? Of course, he had a very impressive win against Povetkin. So who is his next opponent potentially? Before we go into that, I want to have a bit of a review of his performance at the weekend. I think it was a brilliant performance. Of course, he got the stoppage victory. And I actually made some notes round by round just of the key things that I saw in that performance and why I think it was such a great performance, even from as early as the ring entrances. So going into round one, what I noticed is that Dillian Whyte took center ring straight away, and he established his jab nice and early, crisp, sharp jab, mixing it up. And I thought that was very, very impressive early on. And it was a bit strange because the early exchanges had Povetkin a bit off balance, and he was like wobbly legged. And I don't know if it was the fact that obviously age is starting to catch up to him, or it was the fact that he was, of course, recovering from COVID, or it might have just been a combination of both of them ultimately. But he just didn't seem right. He seemed off the pace a little bit. And to be fair, in the first fight, he wasn't particularly impressive. You know, Dillian Whyte knocked him down a few times before ultimately he got knocked out by that punch that he didn't see. So it's not to say that Povetkin looked very different from the first fight in terms of, you know, the fact that he was a bit wobbly leg, but it seemed even more so. It seemed more amplified in this fight. And especially the fact that it was so early on, like in the first round, he's still a bit wobbly. I thought that was a bit strange. That was a bit weird. And it kind of put some doubts in my mind early on about how well Povetkin would do and whether he could take Dillian Whyte to those later rounds, because my initial prediction was that ultimately Dillian Whyte would win by stoppage, but in the later rounds, he would be and box a bit more cautious early on, and then take Povetkin a distance and then stop him later on. But yeah, the way that he approached the first round, he was like straight flying off the blocks. Like I said, established his jab early and was willing to get involved in the exchanges early on. And I noticed that he chose to throw the overhand right in exchanges with Povetkin early on as well. Again, which is something that I found quite interesting. He was you know, throwing that overhand right, and of course that's one of Povetkin's better punches. So the fact that he was willing to, you know, throw exchanges with Povetkin using Povetkin's best punch, I thought was a bit interesting, and of course just a show of his confidence and the fact that he felt comfortable enough to do that very, very early on. But again, I mentioned towards the end of that round that Povetkin looked visibly tired, breathing heavily. Of course, he was carrying extra weight in this fight. I think it was 4 pounds that he had put on in this particular fight. And ultimately, the reason for him doing that is the fact that he wanted to be more resistant to Dillian Whyte's power and his punches and whatnot. But I don't know how much of an impact that really had. I don't know how well it did for him, because he just didn't look at the races ultimately. So I gave the first round to Dillian Whyte. Second round, Whyte still kept the jab going, but started to follow up with a backhand. So he was throwing 1-2s now. He was throwing the jab, head, body, mixing it up, and then bringing in the backhand, which I think was brilliant. Of course, textbook in terms of his approach, which was great. And then I noticed that Whyte was now starting to try and time Povetkin. So he was trying to counter him. He would try and like slip one of Povetkin's punches and then counter him with something, which I started finding quite interesting. Like the fact that he was trying to get that timing in, and he was really, you could see that he'd definitely been working on his defense. He was a lot sharper. He was a lot more aware. He was evading punches. He was getting out of the way. He was moving well, which was, again, another reason why I found the performance quite impressive. Round 3. So round 2 I gave to Whyte as well, obviously. So going into round 3, Whyte's 2 rounds to 0 for Povetkin. He was still moving well, sharp in defense. And then there was one particular shot that was, I think, the punch of the round, where he timed Povetkin. Both of them threw overhand rights. He slipped Povetkin's overhand right, and he landed his own. And I thought that was basically the punch of the round, because you could see like it proper buzzed Povetkin. He took a step back, and yeah, it was a bit more of the same from Whyte in that round. Still keeping the jab going, still hitting Povetkin with 1-2s, and then also bringing in the overhand right. And in the fourth round, going into obviously Whyte's 3-0 up on the scorecards. Ultimately, the round that he stopped Povetkin. I think the key difference in the fourth round was that Whyte was still having success with those 3 punches, with the jab, the 1-2, and the overhand right. But now he brought in the left hook on the odd occasion, and of course that was the punch that ultimately ended things for Povetkin. He threw a 1-2. Povetkin then stumbled back, went against the ropes. After coming back off the ropes, he threw another 1-2 that stumbled Povetkin again. And then whilst he was still trying to find his feet and whatnot, Whyte hits him with the left hook, the same left hook that we see him end Derek Chisora with as well. And that was all she wrote. You know, Povetkin tried to get back up after that. And I think initially the referee was going to allow him to continue. But then he stumbled a bit. After getting up and the ref wiping down his gloves, he stumbled a bit, which is why the referee then waved it off at the same time as his corner threw in the towel. So I think, yeah, they were both on the same page in the sense that, you know, they could both see that Povetkin wasn't able to continue. He was in no state to carry on that fight. And if the fight had continued, I think it would have been a very, very nasty knockout for Dillian Whyte. But ultimately, he gets the win. He gets back his WBC interim title. And, you know, it's what is next on the cards and what is next on the agenda for Dillian Whyte. Now, the interesting thing is, if you listen to the post-fight interview that both he and Eddie Hearn did, when Eddie Hearn was asked about what's next for Whyte, he was very coy in his response, and he didn't actually answer the question. You know, he was speaking about the fact that Gibraltar was a great place for them to fight, and there is potential hopes that they could return for another fight there in the future. You know, he was talking about there being a potential fight in the summer, maybe him going out to the States or whatever for a fight out there. But he didn't really answer the question, which was ultimately around whether Dillian Whyte would be willing to fight Deontay Wilder, right? That's the ultimate question. That is the fight that people are gagging for, because there is that build-up. Of course, it has been long documented that those two have not been not been particularly cordial and haven't really liked each other. There's been back and forth. Of course, Dillian Whyte calling out Wilder. You know, that meme that's gone around where he's shouting, "Let's go, let's go." You've obviously got Wilder, who initially wanted the Whyte fight if it meant that he could get the Joshua fight afterwards, and all that kind of stuff. You're aware of all of those conversations that have been had. So for all of those reasons, obviously it's a fight that a lot of people want to see, right? Now, the stance that Dillian Whyte has is that he feels that he is deserving of a world title fight and he should be having a world title fight. And ultimately, that's neither here nor there. We can argue until the cows come home about how much he deserves to have a world title fight. The fact of the matter is, it's not going to be next. He's not going to have a world title fight next because he's not a mandatory challenger for the WBC. He's the #1 contender. And obviously the difference being that every year, whoever is the WBC champion has to have one mandatory fight against a mandatory challenger, and are mandated by the WBC to have that fight. However, he's not the mandatory challenger. He's the #1 contender, which means that the whoever has the belt, the WBC belt, who obviously at this point in time is Tyson Fury, has to voluntarily defend his title against Dillian Whyte if he so wishes, but he's not obliged to. It's not a mandatory, right? But anyway, we know it's the best kept secret that Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury are going to be fighting for undisputed. Of course, Tyson Fury has a WBC and Anthony Joshua has every other belt, right? WBA, IBF, WBO, IBO, he's got everything else, right? And that fight is going to be a 2-fight deal. We know that. It's not going to be just the single fight. It's going to be a 2-fight deal, which leaves Dillian Whyte in a position where he needs to stay active. He needs to fight someone in the interim whilst Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury, lock horns and do whatever they need to do. In my perspective, and from my point of view, there are only 2 fights that should absolutely happen, potentially, with Dillian Whyte, right? Only 2 people who I think make sense for him to fight. And that is either Deontay Wilder or Andy Ruiz. And why? It's very simple. I already mentioned before that Deontay Wilder is the fight that all of the fans are gagging for. So that's very easy to make, especially now with COVID restrictions ending and the fact that fans are now allowed to go to fights. And at the point that they do negotiate his next fight, fans will be in attendance, like at Dillian Whyte's fight, right? So there's already the backstory. It's a pay-per-view fight, 100%. So that fight makes the most sense, right? The other fight that potentially makes sense is a fight against Andy Ruiz, okay? Now, Andy Ruiz, who recently fought Anthony Joshua, is still a very live and game opponent. He's only got 2 losses on his resume. The first one being against Joseph Parker for the WBO title, which was, to some, a questionable result because some felt that Andy Ruiz won that fight against Joseph Parker. And then, of course, he lost against Anthony Joshua in the rematch, right? But of course, we saw in both of those fights just how much of a live wire he is. So much so that in the second fight, after knocking out Joshua in the first fight, in the second fight, Joshua didn't want to engage. Of course, there's people that have criticized Joshua's performance and said that he ran around all night. I'm not of that belief. Like, I don't subscribe to that belief that he was just running. I thought it was a brilliant boxing performance, a boxing masterclass. He showed the sweet science. But we can't deny the fact that part of the reason why he changed his approach was because he knew that on the inside, Andy Ruiz was a live opponent, right? So he's still, with only 2 respectable losses, because ultimately he also was a part of the reason why he lost in that second fight, because of the fact that he didn't really train properly. He didn't approach that fight in the way that he should have. He's still a very, very live opponent. And then, of course, going back to Deontay Wilder, I think the fact that he's out of sight and out of mind at the moment makes people forget that he only has 1 loss. And that loss is a loss to Tyson Fury, who is arguably the king of the hill, right? He's arguably the best heavyweight in the division. So there's no shame losing to someone of the ilk of Tyson Fury. Before that, Deontay Wilder knocked out every single one of the guys that he stepped in the ring with, right? So he's still a respectable opponent. And if we're keeping it a buck, if we're being completely honest, with the win against Povetkin, Dillian Whyte has literally just done what he was expected to do. Even after that fight, the second fight, he said it in his interview that he wishes that he got it right the first time because he was expected to. Of course, Povetkin, given the fact that he has had such a great career and the fact that he has been an Olympic gold medalist and the fact that he has mixed it up with some of the best in the division, of course, he's always going to be somewhat of a live opponent. But ultimately, at 41 years of age, he's an opponent that Dillian Whyte should be beating comfortably, right? Let's have it right. So a win over Povetkin is great for the record, great for your resume, but ultimately you're doing what is expected of you. And fights of that magnitude or fights of that ilk against people at that level isn't really going to move the needle. It's not going to cause fans to clamour and call for Dillian Whyte to have a world title fight. I'm just being honest, right? He's just doing what he's expected to do. Only a fight against either Deontay Wilder or Andy Ruiz puts you in a position where people are going to absolutely demand for you to get that world title fight, because of the fact that both of those people are the last 2 people that Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury fought, right? Anthony Joshua regained his titles against Andy Ruiz, and Tyson Fury won the WBC belt against Deontay Wilder. So, from a logical perspective, only a fight against one of those 2 are going to make the world stand up and pay attention to the fact that, right, he absolutely should be in the position as mandatory or the next person to fight for the world title, because of the fact that he's beaten people on this level at this point in time. Povetkin has been a world a challenger. He has had the heavyweight title before, but he's past his best. He's in the twilight of his career, and even now his promoter is talking about trying to persuade him to end his career. Like, he's been there, he's done it, he's got the t-shirt. There's nothing else for him to prove, right? So ultimately, only a fight against one of those 2 that I mentioned is going to move the needle for Dillian Whyte. But with how things seem and the body language and the talk that I saw from both him and Eddie Hearn after that fight, I can't see either of those 2 being his next fight, ultimately, because it is a huge risk. Excuse me. Those 2 are the biggest potential risks for Dillian Whyte, and he's always revered as the guy that is always willing to roll the dice and is always willing to take those risks. But at this point in time, especially with how things went a bit left against Povetkin in the first fight, maybe he's going to be a bit more cautious with his opponent selection whilst AJ and Fury deal with whatever they're dealing with, right? So, aside from those 2 other potential opponents that I think Dillian Whyte could fight against are Luis Ortiz and Otto Wallin, right? So the first being Luis Ortiz, who currently has 36 fights, 32 wins, 27 by KO, and his only 2 losses in his career have come against Deontay Wilder, right? He's the same age as Povetkin at 41 years of age. And he has long been regarded as the boogeyman of the division. You know, there's been, even whilst he was going through that process when he was fighting against Wilder, Wilder kept on saying it, that he's always been ducked, that AJ ducked Luis Ortiz, that no one wants to fight him, that he was signed by Matchroom before just so that Eddie Hearn could keep him away from AJ and all of that kind of stuff, right? He's long been regarded as the boogeyman of the division. His Cuban style, the fact that he's very slick, he's got power and he can box, has been a reason why a lot of people have avoided him. But it's an interesting name to throw in the hat because, like I said, he's the same age as Povetkin, so he's on the decline. He's 41 years of age, and it can be positioned that he still poses enough of a threat to be considered as an opponent that Dillian Whyte is rolling the dice against, right? So in terms of his resume, it's a brilliant name for Dillian Whyte to have on his resume because of the fact that he's only got losses to Wilder, and also because of the fact that you know, he's still a bit of a slickster in terms of his boxing style and what he can do inside the ring. So it's enough for it to be billed as, you know, Dillian Whyte is taking another risk again. You know, he's the interim WBC champion, but he's taking this risk against Luis Ortiz, who's only lost to Wilder, who's the biggest puncher in the heavyweight division. And you get my drift. You get my drift, right? You catch my drift. So there's Luis Ortiz. The other person who I think he could potentially fight is going to be one of these two, I think. Luis Ortiz or Otto Wallin. So Otto Wallin's got 24 fights, 22 wins, 14 by way of knockout. And his only loss at this point in time is a loss to Tyson Fury by unanimous decision, right? So obviously, everyone remembers after Fury and Wilder fought for the first time, instead of having the immediate rematch, Tyson Fury went away and he had two other tune-ups, one of which was Otto Wallin, before then going back into the Deontay Wilder fight. Now, the reason why I see Otto Wallin as a potential opponent for Dillian Whyte is the fact that his most recent fight was a unanimous decision victory against Dominic Breazeale. And prior to that, he stopped Travis Kaufman in 5 rounds, which was half the time it took Luis Ortiz to stop him. However, Travis Kaufman was coming off an 18-month layoff after fighting Luis Ortiz and then going into the Otto Wallin fight. But again, Otto Wallin is an opponent where he poses just enough risk. Ultimately, both of these potential fights in Luis Ortiz or Otto Wallin are fights that Dillian Whyte at this point should win. But they pose just enough of a threat for it to be billed in the media as a huge dice roll from Dillian Whyte and a fight that, you know, could be a risk for him. And you know, he's this brave guy that always is willing to take these huge and big risks and whatnot. But it's very strategic in terms of that decision. And I think ultimately, like I said before, he should be fighting either Deontay Wilder or or Andy Ruiz. But I don't think he's going to fight either of those two. I think it's going to be Luis Ortiz or Otto Wallin. And if it's not either of those two, if in the event it's neither of those two, I think the fight that he does have isn't going to be one that's going to be universally accepted as a good fight. I think if it's anyone else, then the fans aren't really going to clamour for it. There's not going to be much interest. There's not going to be much appetite for it. And it'll just be someone else who is potentially ranked, but isn't a great potential fight. And the thing is, we've seen it so many times before that there are these guys that are well ranked within certain governing bodies, but when they get in the ring and they fight, you think to yourself, how on earth is this person ranked in the top 10? Or how is this person ranked in the top 5? Like, what they're displaying, what they're showing isn't someone who should really be at this level. We saw that even most recently with Canelo when he fought against Avni Yildirim. He was regarded as the #1 mandatory for the WBC, but on what grounds? What has he done? The guy had been out of the ring for such a long time. He'd been previously stopped by Chris Eubank Jr. He'd lost in his last fight as well. So, coming off a loss and a layoff, and then he gets the Canelo fight as a mandatory, So some of these rankings are certainly questionable. But yeah, ultimately, it's got to be one of those four. Those are the only four in my mind that make sense. And anything else is really just something to keep him ticking over. But anything else isn't going to be enough to justify why he should be given a voluntary defense against one of AJ or Fury, whoever wins that fight, when it's time for them to, right? Only a win against Andy Ruiz or Deontay Wilder absolutely cements him as that #1 mandatory position fighter in my perspective and in my point of view. But that's just how I see it. I would love to see and hear from you in terms of your perspective. Who do you feel Dillian Whyte should fight next? Where do you think he goes from here? Who is a fighter that is a worthwhile opponent for him, Not just someone for him to stat pad, not just for someone for him to tick the box against, but who is a good enough opponent for him to show why he deserves to be the next person in line for a title fight. Because he still has to, in my perspective, it might be an unpopular opinion, but in my point of view, he still needs to prove it. He still needs to prove himself. So let me know what you think. Please, in the comments, leave your thoughts, leave your perspectives and your points of view. Again, a reminder, please make sure you're hitting that subscribe button, hit that like button, share the video, and keep it locked because we've got more content coming soon. Okay, Budge over and out.